Stress is the inflammation that robs us of life, energy, and happiness. Our typical solutions for gut health and hormone balance have let a lot of us down. We're over-medicated and underserved. At The Less Stressed Life, we're a community of health-savvy women exploring solutions outside of our traditional Western medicine toolbox and training to raise the bar and change our stories. Each week, our hope is that you leave our sessions inspired to learn, grow, and share these stories to raise the bar in your life and home. All right, today on The Less Stressed Life, I have Dr. Michael Robinson, who's a naturopathic doctor specializing in naturopathic oncology in the Chicago suburbs. He's the owner of Nourish Healthcare, a multidisciplinary natural healthcare clinic, and manages a team of multiple naturopathic doctors, nutritionists, and acupuncturists, as well as he is a staff doctor at the AR Clinic. AR Clinic, thank you, of Contemporary Medicine, the oldest low-dose chemotherapy clinic in the U.S. Super cool. He's also a professor of oncology and immunology for the University of Western States. He holds a bachelor's of science in health sciences, a master of science in applied clinical nutrition, a doctorate in naturopathic medicine. This is so helpful to see because it's like, how do you learn about oncology nutrition? But he's certified in oncology nutrition via the Oncology Nutrition Institute and is a licensed naturopathic physician, a licensed dietitian nutritionist, and a certified nutrition specialist. So we got a lot to talk about. I don't know how he fit in all those years of education with this baby face, but let's jump into it. Welcome, Dr. Robinson.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be with you guys. What do you want to know about? I'm happy to talk about it.
I'd love to hear first about your story and how cancer became part of your practice. I'm sure there's a backstory to this. And weaved in there, why did you go to school for so long, right? If you became a dietitian, were you a nutritionist and then you became a naturopath as well?
I've worked in many aspects of healthcare. So actually, even in undergrad, I was a phlebotomist and an IV infusionist. And that was really when I got started, is I was doing IVs for people to their house to do hydration IVs in those sort of scenarios. And honestly, I hated it. I didn't like it, as I went home every day miserable because I'd go to the patients' houses and there'd be these stage 4 patients grabbing my hand saying, save me, save me, save me. And I'm just here to do your IV. I can't do that. I'm not the doctor in this scenario. So I actually, throughout my undergrad and even into medical school, as I went through most of medical school saying I'm never going to work with oncology patients again. I thought I was going to be in a totally separate field. But then when we got to our clinical internship, starting seeing real patients in medical school, out of the class of 30 soon-to-be doctors in my cohort, no one knew what to do when a cancer patient would come in. And they knew my background and my history of being in the field. So they would come to me with all the questions in the world anytime a cancer patient came in, and I had the knowledge base to be able to answer. And I started going into the consult rooms with the other students to help them out. And the patients quickly realized, like, oh, this is the person that really knows what's going on, not the intern I'm meeting with. And they started latching on to me. And it was a different experience because now, as the provider, now me being able to make decisions and help the people, it was totally different. And I was able to empower and help the patients. And I fell back in love with it. And that's where, as soon as I could, I got the opportunity to start shadowing again as a provider with actual patients in the real life in the AR clinic. And I knew right away that this is where I was meant to be.
I love that story. That's very good. So you've been practicing. You fit a lot into your day right now. You have a busy clinic, and then you're a professor as well. I really want you to unpack how some of that kind of interplays into your day-to-day work. But maybe we should jump straight into cancers you see. So after school, where were you going to school? And then tell us how you kind of ended up in the suburbs of Chicago. It sounds like maybe you were going to school in that area originally, right? Were you interning at the AR clinic?
Yeah. So both my bachelor's and my doctorate are from schools in Illinois near my house. So my doctorate's from National University of Health Sciences. There's only 7 accredited naturopathic medical schools across North America, US, and Canada combined. So not many options for the Midwest because everything is off on California and on the West Coast. So about quarters of the way through my doctorate program, I started to say, I was learning a whole bunch of general practice natural medicine, but I knew that I wanted nutrition to be a major focus of how I was going to treat patients. And honestly, even in naturopathic medical school, I wasn't learning enough of the nutrition that I wanted to. So I added on the master's truly at New York Chiropractic College at the time, is now Northeast College of Health Sciences. So I ended up completing both my master's and my doctorate degrees basically at the same time, graduated a month apart from each other with both of those. So as soon as I graduated, I went right into practice, opened my own clinic right away.
Nice. Well, if it makes you feel better, where I went to school, I feel like we didn't learn enough about nutrition either. I'm sure you know already, right?
Yeah, that's always the case. And I teach doctors of clinical nutrition now, and some of these people have been in practice for 20 years and are now going back and getting their doctorate, and there's always more to learn in medicine.
Yeah, always more to learn. Okay, let's jump into kind of day to day when you're seeing cancer patients. You said you'd opened your own clinic right after school. Talk to me about common types of cancer that you see in your clinic day in, day out, week in, week out.
So it's kind of funny how it's split between, I definitely see hundreds of breast cancer and colon cancer patients per year just because of how common breast cancer and colon cancer and prostate cancer are. So of course we see the common cancers because they're so common, right? I probably see over 250 breast cancer patients a year. That's definitely probably our biggest demographic there. But outside of the couple very, very, very common, then I also see an abnormally large amount of the extremely rare cancers, because those are the patients that know conventional medicine doesn't really have many answers for them, right? These cancers with 1% and 2% survival rates in the conventional system, those are the patients that need to seek additional personalized care and need to do everything they can. So my practice gets flooded with a whole bunch of extremely rare cancers or very deadly cancers to be able to offer them everything, right? And it's kind of split.
Yeah. So when people come in like that, are they flying into the Chicago area to see you?
Very often, yes, especially if they are going to come in to do our low-dose chemotherapy. There's only about 30 clinics across the US that do the low-dose chemotherapy aspect of it, and we're the oldest one. So we have the history aspect. So people fly in from all over North America to come in for that. I do see people virtually as well if it's a scenario where they're going to stay with their medical oncologist, do standard of care chemotherapy or radiation, whatever it is, but then they're just seeing me for supportive therapies to try to mitigate side effects of their chemo, for example. Then I offer that virtually as well.
When someone comes into your practice to see you, I know there's several people in your practice. What does that care plan maybe look like? And another way to say this is maybe what are some of those pieces of the treatment pie? Do they come in and see you one time, or do they come in and kind of get all the modalities over time?
So it depends on where the patients are. We like to get them early on as soon as they're diagnosed, because we know the stages they're going to go through. We know that they're going to be prescribed surgery and then prescribed chemo and then prescribed an immunotherapy. So we like to make the whole trajectory, but it's very common for patients to not come in until they've already started treatment, and then they are like, I need support, I need help, I need to get better. But when they come in, it's a 2-hour patient visit where we spend the whole first hour reviewing the whole history of their disease and just their lifestyle and everything about them in general. But then the second hour is spent making a pretty comprehensive treatment plan. So I do have a whole team that helps out the patients, where I say I handle the higher level medical stuff. I will go through their labs, their medications, their supplements, make sure there's no interactions, and design supplement and herb and vitamin plans that play along with their conventional chemotherapy, or make sure it's compatible with their radiation therapy or whatever they're doing. We also offer many other therapies such as Mistletoe. So I have someone on staff specifically that just helps the patients go through their Mistletoe therapy, or we're doing IV vitamin C or hyperbaric chambers, and we have staff dedicated for that. And then we're also a teaching clinic. So I have oncology interns where a lot of the patients, after a 2-hour meeting with me, they get so much information. They're overwhelmed, especially with what they're going through and the stress in their life. It's a lot for them. So they get all this information after 2 hours. Sometimes they go home and a week later, they're like, I forgot 90% of what he said. So then I have an oncology intern that's there for just that they can call up and say, hey, I know this thing was prescribed to me, but I forgot why. Can you talk to me about why this is indicated in my case? That sort of scenario. So we have the hand-holding aspect as well. But then almost all of my patients, I'm recommending, we have an acupuncturist on staff. I'm recommending acupuncture at the same time. And very commonly, we're a big hyperbaric clinic and using hyperbaric medicine in our office as well. So it's a whole team.
Cool. Can we talk about some of those individual therapies? I don't know what mistletoe therapy is.
Yeah, so mistletoe is injections of the plant mistletoe. It's widely used over in Germany. There's probably hundreds of studies on mistletoe. And actually, in the hospital system, it's like 80% of cancer patients get it alongside their standard of care. Just the US medical system kind of has this approach where they don't do an intervention until there's US studies. They don't really care what's happening in your sort of scenario. Mistletoe's been around for a very long time. It just was never done in the US until 8 weeks ago or so, or maybe March 2023, John Hopkins finally just published the first US mistletoe trial, and it was positive, and we knew it was going to be positive because it's been done 100 times over in Europe before. But we hope that this is the first study to really get this to be a popular medicine, popular option for people in the United States. But when you look at some of the data, even in stage 4 population studies, sometimes there's 40% increased survival times with mistletoe therapy as an adjunctive to what they're already doing. And I'll tell you, there's a whole bunch of chemotherapy drugs that do not have a 40% increased survival time. It's a really efficacious therapy with virtually no side effects. Mistletoe doesn't kill cancer. Mistletoe stimulates your immune system, stimulating your immune system to fight back against the cancer. So it's a way to get some cancer fighting ability, but then also to just build your body up from all the chemo and everything like that.
I'm wondering, did you travel internationally, or do you have international colleagues where you learned some of these things that were what are some of the things that we do internationally in cancer care that we don't do in the US? I know that's kind of a loaded question. But then we're talking about mistletoe.
Yeah. I haven't been to Europe or Germany or anything like that for any of the training. They do mistletoe training in the United States through a couple different institutes here. But yes, I do travel around North America. So this year I was at a Integrative Oncology conference. I was one of the speakers down in Mexico where patients flew from all over the world. It was probably half US and Mexican doctors, but there was a number of doctors from Eastern European doctors that are wanting to learn about a bunch of these different therapies coming over to us to learn. So it's nice to see and have that exposure to what is everyone from around the world doing, where sometimes various therapies are not available everywhere. Like there's a doctor from South Africa there, and at the end he came up to me and said, "Everything you said sounds absolutely amazing. I have no idea how to give this stuff." So it's interesting.
Right. And that's what we say maybe about this mistletoe therapy. It sounds like it's IV, given alongside cancer treatment in Germany, but unless people can come into your office or find a place that does mistletoe therapy, they're kind of out of luck, probably, right? It's not something they can necessarily do.
It's a cutaneous injection. Write the order for it so the patients can get it, but it's a tiny little diabetic insulin needle that they're injecting into their belly fat typically.
Oh, easy.
We just train all the patients how to do it on their own. It's not an expensive therapy at all. It's about $20 per injection. You do an injection about once per week. So we tell people, don't pay to come into our office to do a 5-second procedure. We just train you how to do it and then have the pharmacy drop ship it to you directly.
Cool. Sounds like you've thought through a lot of these things. I really appreciate this. Okay, so back to international. Is there anything that you took away from that Integrative Oncology conference internationally where you're like, oh, wow, over here they do this, and I wish we had this in the United States? Or do you feel like you are able to access a lot of the things that you want?
I really wish in the United States there was better access to peptides and a lot of different peptides. Peptides are basically just tiny proteins, but a large amount of the peptide therapies, and peptides are popular right now, Ozempic or semaglutide, everybody is on as a peptide drug to try to lose weight right now. It's all over the news. But there's a bunch of different medications that are peptides, and I even hesitate calling them medications because they're a very natural substance. But the majority of peptides are in a gray area called research chemicals, which means it's not an FDA-approved drug, but it also doesn't meet the criteria of a supplement, so it gets thrown into a gray area called a research chemical. And technically, they're only supposed to be used to do research, so unless you're injecting it into rats, they're not really commercially available in the United States, except for some unique scenarios. So when Ozempic or semaglutide is the generic of Ozempic, how that got approved in the United States was the pharmaceutical company basically patented the pen injector to be able to inject it into you because you can't patent a peptide itself. So now they're able to sell it at pharmacies and everything like that. But that's the thing with peptides. If peptides are dirt cheap things, they're very, very, very inexpensive natural biological substances. Many of them have been used in other countries, not just for cancer, but for all kinds of health issues for decades. We're talking 30, 40 years. Some of them have 60 years of clinical trials of use in Russia. but no drug company wants to spend $22 million to get it approved as a drug here in the United States because they cost 5 cents to make and they're not patentable. So there's all this competition. They're not going to put in the money to get it approved and then not be able to make any money back off of it. It's just, that's not what healthcare should be about. It shouldn't be, let's only approve the things that we can make a giant profit off of. Who cares if it's saving people's lives? So that's the frustrating part here.
So you don't really have access to peptides like you would like them to be?
Vast majority of peptides that I wish I had access to is we don't have access to in the United States. There's maybe 20 or so that are available via compounding pharmacies that, again, just that process makes it very costly compared to what they actually would be. But I mean, the reality is that patients come into me all day long taking these peptides from, they either flew out of the country to get them or they're ordering them online on the black market. And it's like, yeah, I wish this is something I could prescribe to you, but they've decided that they care about their life more than, what they'll do whatever they have to do to get their medication sort of scenario. And that's where we're at right now.
Right. Which is why we're having this conversation, partly because you have to know what options are out there and maybe who they can come see, et cetera. What's the mechanism of action of peptides on cancer?
It varies. There's many, many, many different types of peptides. Some of the most popular ones are thymus extract. This is an organ that produces immune cells. So thymus extract peptides are the same thing, as they really, really strongly activate your immune system. And those are peptides that, again, exist in the United States because they're given to AIDS patients that have no immune system, and they are FDA approved for that population to give them some immune function. But it's like there are patients other than AIDS patients that need immune activity. So that's where technically they're available in the United States. They're just being used off label for other indications. There are other peptides. There's one called PNC. PNC directly inhibits, it activates an enzyme that tells the cancer cell to kill itself off. It directly causes apoptosis. It actually went through some clinical trials here and got paused because it killed some of the rats in the study because of something called tumor lysis syndrome, which means it killed the cancer too well. It broke down the cancer too quickly. And then all that dead tissue and debris overwhelmed the kidneys and the liver, and the body couldn't process all of it. It's kind of like how burn victims sometimes don't die of the burn, they die of all the dead tissue that the body can't process. It's a similar scenario with PNC, and it kind of got halted in the clinical trials because it caused strong tumor lysis and it broke down the too quickly. And to me, it's like, well, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a place. That means we just have to figure out how to dose it better. We need to do more studies to figure out how to use it more appropriately so that we can use it for its benefits, but not kill people in the process, obviously, is the main goal, right?
I feel like you're so organized in your practice and with the university that if you're not already doing studies, it's in the near future for you. Are you doing some studies in the clinic?
We do. So I do a lot of speaking around the US and a lot of clinical presentation sort of stuff to do what a lot of people will refer to as a randomized controlled trial, double-blind study. Those are really, really hard to do in our type of medicine because we give multiple different therapies at a time, and trials are all about one intervention at a time sort of thing. And that's just not what we think medicine should be like. They want to change one variable at a time. So clinical trials are hard on that aspect, as well as they're incredibly, incredibly expensive. So most of what we do is our patients, but then when we get surprising outcome, that we're going and publishing the data after the fact and sharing the knowledge.
All right. So we went through mistletoe therapy, went through peptides. You mentioned also having an IV vitamin C and HBot in the clinic. So I interviewed Jeannie Driscoll one time about IV vitamin C. I think she had the first NIH study in the US for IV vitamin C therapy. Will you share a little bit about when you use IV vitamin C therapy, maybe what cancers use it for and what kind of results you see with it and how often you use it, and just a little bit more about it?
Okay, so IV vitamin C has applications in a lot of different aspects of cancer care. Really, it's an oxidative therapy. So many things that we do in cancer treatments are oxidative therapies. IV vitamin C is, I mentioned hyperbaric chambers is a way to deliver oxygen. There's ozone therapy, that's an oxidative therapy. all the oxidative therapies are doing a similar goal. Cancer can't survive in oxygen-rich environments. It has a very hard time surviving in oxygen-rich environments because it doesn't have the same metabolic pathways that normal human cells do. It more so metabolizes kind of similar to how bacteria and fungus do, and most bacteria and fungus, again, also don't really like oxygen. So it's a way that we can deliver exogenous amounts of oxygen to the body to get some cancer fighting ability. But at the same time, your normal human cells love oxygen. So it's a way that we can really get a beneficial building up of the immune system at the same time, which also fighting back cancer at the same time. There has been a number of clinical trials on it. There's not just one, but it's used in various different scenarios, such as post-radiation therapy. So radiation therapy is also an oxidative therapy that destroys a lot of body tissue very, very strongly. A lot of patients will use vitamin C to recover, to make sure we can clean up all the damage that's been done after the radiation therapy, for example.
So you can kind of use it all over the place, right?
Yes. And IV vitamin C is probably one of the biggest alternative medicine things out there for cancer, and people know about it. And the medical oncologists know about it. And to them, they will very commonly tell their patients not to do it because they know the therapies that they're delivering, such as radiation therapy, is an oxidative therapy. And vitamin C, they know, is an antioxidant. So in their minds, oxidation plus antioxidant, they cancel each other out, and they think that it's going to make the radiation therapy not doing anything, right? And they don't want to give someone radiation if it's not going to do anything. But we have to say is that's a theoretical thing, or that happens in petri dishes. Humans aren't petri dishes. We have to look at the real clinical trials about what happens in real life people and see that the patients, when we give them radiation and then give IV vitamin C, they do better. There's better survival outcomes. So that's what we have to pay attention to.
When people are doing IV vitamin C, can you speak to doses used in cancer? Because there's a lot of med spa clinics popping up on every block now that do IV drip vitamin therapies. And I'm guessing what is being delivered there is a bit different than what maybe you're doing.
Yeah. So the typical dose for cancer is 50 grams, where most med spas will do like 10 grams. 10 grams is a nice immune system boost if you're trying to recover from a hangover or, after a cold or flu sort of scenario. But that's using vitamin C as an antioxidant. It's obviously patient individualized, but usually vitamin C in an IV will be an antioxidant until you get above, say, 35 grams. And then anything higher than 35 grams, it switches into an oxidative therapy. So some patients will start at 35 and then work their way up to 50. There are other clinics that try to go higher than 50, but it's very rare that there's patients that need that. Honestly, it's kind of a money aspect. It's like, well, if we can charge the patients this much for 50, if I do 75, I can charge them 50% more. So 50 is usually where we shoot for.
Okay. Let's talk about HBot. The other day, I was talking to someone about cognitive, all the things, all the uses for HBot. And a lot of times the dosing is 40 hours over time. What are you using in a cancer clinic? What's the minimum efficacious dose you're looking for?
Again, it depends on what we're using it for. So radiation patients, if it's just radiation recovery, it's like, well, after every radiation session, go and do HBot. So it depends on how many radiation sessions. And sometimes that's 10 or 20, right? If we're looking at just using it as a fighting back against cancer sort of scenario, yeah, you're in the 30 to 40 session range, or you have these patients that have chronic cancers for decades at a time sort of scenario. That's where sometimes we even recommend patients getting their own chamber, and we'll write the order for them to get a chamber in their own house so that they can do it indefinitely. I have probably 50 patients that have gone that route because they want to do therapy 5 or 6 days a week, and it just becomes more cost effective to do it that way.
Is there anything that sticks out to you that you want to share about when you're doing some of these therapies, some of the measurements that you might do before and after? For example, in my practice, I use symptoms as the biggest measurement, even more than labs, just because we care about how we feel the most. In cancer, or when you're doing these measurements, what are some of the things that you guys look for? What are typical outcomes you see from some of these therapies we've talked about so far?
So definitely symptom-wise is how the tumors feel, how the patients feel. All of that is definitely important to us, but there's a number of labs that we can do as well. Standard Oncology mostly just orders a CBC and CMP, which is $2 of blood work to monitor their cancer patients. There are some different calculations that exist in the literature where you can take different pieces of the CBC and do some math to give an idea of what's really going on with the immune system. Is it growing? Is it shrinking sort of scenario? And there are published numbers on there about, oh, outcomes are okay as long as the ratio ends up being here. And we want to try to shift those ratios around. But then there's also what we would just call traditional tumor markers. So the best example of that is PSA for males. A male turns 50, they get a PSA test. It's a $1 test. And if it's elevated, it means they have prostate cancer. And then if it's going up, it means their prostate cancer is getting worse, right? There's the equivalent of that for dozens of other cancers. There's 3 for breast cancer. There's colon cancer ones, lung cancer ones. It's just they're not honestly used that often in the conventional system, mostly because of an insurance financial reason sort of scenario. But they're not very expensive tests when you get into the cash world. We're talking $30 tests to give us an idea as, hey, is your cancer getting better or worse?
Can you talk about what some of those are called?
Yeah, most of them have abbreviations. So like ovarian cancer one is probably one that a lot of OB-GYNs will use. It's a CA125. But then at breast cancer, there's a CA2729. CA stands for cancer antigen. It's a CA15-3, also used in breast cancer. And some of them have overlap. So like a 15-3 will be used in breast cancer, some ovarian cancers, uterine cancer, things like that. And then a CEA is traditionally a colon cancer marker, but also shows up in the majority of lung cancer, shows up in about 70% of breast cancers. And then CA19-9, again, is traditionally a pancreatic cancer marker, but shows up in stomach cancers and liver cancers and other things like that. So there's dozens of them, but a lot of them are these random numbers, and they have applicability to not just the main cancer they were designed for.
This is interesting. Do you think in the future there will ever be like cancer screening blood draws, or they kind of encompass several of these, or does this already exist? I feel like people are interested in preventing or not having cancer with the rates going up.
Yes. And 2 things is some commercial tests are available and advertise that. I don't want to throw anyone under the bus, but there's a lot of issues with a lot of them out there. They're very misleading. They'll do one single marker and say that this marker shows up in 60 different cancers. So if that marker is normal, then you don't have 60 different cancers. And it's like, well, it might show up in 2% of breast cancers, but if it doesn't show up in 98% of breast cancers, then it's not really that good of a screener for breast cancer. That makes sense. And it's a $1,000 test. So a lot of the commercial tests that exist out there aren't where we need them to be. But to your point, and kind of what we can do is I go all the time and lobby for, advocate for this, even at these conferences with medical oncologists, and say a PSA test, like I talked about, that prostate specific antigen test that we run on every single male when they're 50 and 60 because it costs 50 cents to run. If you run that at a female, it's a very high likelihood if it comes back positive that they have ovarian cancer or breast cancer or something that's not right because they don't have a prostate, right? I advocate, why don't we run a PSA on a female every year, starting at 35 or 40 or so, to do some screening for breast cancer? And I get these pushbacks of, we would spend so many unnecessary healthcare dollars doing that. We would get all these negatives that it's not worth it. And my opinion is just like, if you just ask the patient, would you want to pay 50 cents to do this test to, potentially screen if something comes up? Every female in America would do that, right? So I try, but so much of what we do here in the US is driven by insurance policies and dollars, really, that we're kind of far away from that being standard of care.
Yeah. While we're on the topic of things that annoy you and cancer care, is there anything else you want to throw into that bucket?
The majority of patients come into me wanting something that is not what they actually need. It's very common that patients come into us with a stage 4 cancer diagnosis, highly aggressive cancer, and they know I'm a naturopathic doctor and want me to make a plan to juice away their cancer, for example. And it's like, maybe when this was 2 years ago, stage 1 cancer, and it was a millimeter big, sure, that's the time that if you want to try to juice away your cancer, maybe there's some success with that. But the intervention that we do has to match the disease. And if you have this raging disease all over your body, just starting doing some juices a couple times a week is not going to do anything. So a lot of the times I'm having to talk patients into surgery and things like that. Because a lot of breast cancers, if you get a breast cancer stage 1 or stage 2 even, they have 99% survival rates as long as they're treated appropriately with surgical intervention. It's mostly just cut the tumor out of there and over a 99% chance that everything's going to be just fine and you're going to live. I can't tell somebody to not do a 99% chance of beating their cancer by taking a gamble and going and doing some juicing, right? So I have to do a lot of talking the patients into, yes, stay with your conventional medical doctor, do the surgery, get your 99% chance, and then I will be there to build your body up, support you as much as we can, keep you as strong as we can, make sure you heal properly from surgery so that you can get the best outcomes that you're looking for.
That was a good one. Okay, since we're on the topic of breast cancer now, you said earlier, and I've been seeing this unravel with friends, that surgery is usually the most common situation. I just had a friend who had to have chemotherapy for several treatments before surgery because it was like intertwined into the tissue. But what I am seeing or hearing from them is surgery, and then sometimes tamoxifen is recommended. And so this is where my brain goes when I see that, because I think the mechanism is reducing estrogen. And I just think to myself, there's a lot of metabolic pathways for estrogen to go down. And at the very top, even though I don't think it's always indicated, is diindyl methane, or DIM, supports it. So is DIM DIM almost like a natural tamoxifen, or am I way off board here? Just curious. This is what my brain is thinking about.
Yeah, there are similar analogs to some of the natural medications. So depending on the person's age, they may either get anastrozole as the common one, or if they're postmenopausal, they'll get tamoxifen. But either way, is that's shutting off a lot of the estrogen that floats around in the body, and it's affecting all estrogen in the body. And kind of to your point, a lot of the estrogen is not necessarily bad, but the doctors don't take the time to measure the various different estrogen metabolites to actually see how much of the bad estrogen is there, how much of the good estrogen is there, and try to get some balancing going on. But DIM and then I3C and calcium D glucarate, CDG, those are things that DIM takes care of the estrogen in the blood. I3C helps the liver process it, and calcium D glucarate helps the bowels and bile really make sure you get the estrogens out of the body. Those are all really good interventions for people in these scenarios that don't have the side effect risk of things like osteoporosis and uterine cancer. That's what they don't talk about enough. You take a tamoxifen for your breast cancer and then you get uterine cancer. Doesn't have the crazy side effect profiles. But are there any clinical trials that take some patients on DIM and some patients on tamoxifen and see what percentage of people do better? There's not, because there's an issue with oncology and research of ethics, where if there is a therapy that they know helps people, you can't put someone into a placebo-controlled trial that may withhold that treatment from them, and then the patient may die. So anytime anything new is invented in the oncology world, it's always keeping the old intervention and then adding something new to it. They never withhold something, which is how we're at the place where a drug called Adriamycin or doxorubicin is the oldest chemotherapy in existence. It's a really, really, really toxic drug that is still used today because they just keep adding new things to the regimen. They don't want to get rid of the old thing because they say, well, what if we do? And then all of our patients die. We just killed all these people in the clinical trial. That wasn't our goal. And that's an ethical issue.
Right. Okay. So you were just talking about with this medication, or this can happen a lot, right? You have one cancer, and then before you know it, you can have a different cancer. I interviewed this very lovely oncologist one time, and I learned a lot from that about when we're doing surgery, we never really quite get it all. And you're never really completely clear from cancer. So it can always grow back, which makes tons of sense in my brain because of how I think about cancer metabolizing. But is there anything you would say about that?
Yeah, so there is a new category of testing out there called MRD testing. MRD stands for monitoring residual disease testing. The company I use is Natera, and they do the Signatera test, but there's a couple of companies out there. So say you do surgery and then they do a scan after to see if everything's all clear. People have to realize when we talk about x-rays, whether it's a mammogram or a CT scan, those types of images can only see a tumor that's about 10,000 cells large. When MRI is our best imaging, and that can see something that's like 8,000 cells large, which means you could have a significant amount of cells, 5,000 cells somewhere that nobody can see on imaging, and they keep telling you you're good to go, even though there's cancer in your body. So MRD testing is a DNA screening test. It can detect significantly better. We're talking on the order of 10 to 100 cells, which is like 1,000 times better than 10,000 cells, right? Their data says that they can detect many cancer recurrences up to 2 years earlier than standard imaging can. So That's what I tell people all the time is if we can find out the cancer is back 2 years earlier than what an image could do, it is so easy to treat the cancer when we're detecting it that early that we don't have to go through a bunch of crazy interventions to do so, as we get to treat you very, very conservatively and get good outcomes.
If you were catching it that early, what would you mean by conservative interventions that you could do?
So that's like what the low dose chemotherapy that we do here. And so the chemotherapy is about a 90% lower dose than what you would get in the standard oncology office. But what we do is instead of just pumping it into your veins and letting it go everywhere in your body, and the reality is 90% of what you put in your veins goes to the non-cancer cells, only 2% of it goes to the cancer cells. We use insulin to drive it to the cancer because cancer metabolizes sugar. So we give the patients insulin, really drop down their blood sugar, take a tiny amount of chemotherapy, mix it into a bag of sugar, basically, infuse it into them. And it's preferentially going to force the chemo to the cancer, not let it go to the rest of the cells, meaning let the chemo do what it's going to do. It's good at killing cancer. Just the problem with chemo is it's not good at keeping the rest of your cells alive. But don't let it go to the rest of your cells. So if we can direct it somewhere, we get the cancer killing ability without the destroying your body at the same time.
Man, does anyone else do that?
There's about 30 clinics across the US that do IPT.
Oh, I was thinking with you were putting glucose in with the chemotherapy or you're dosing it at the same time, right? So that way it goes to that specific piece. Only 30 clinics do that.
Yeah.
Seems like a really efficient way to use and target chemotherapy properly. Seems real smart and cheap.
Funniest part of the whole thing is conventional oncologists all the time are like, oh, there's no way that could work. But then let me go order a PET scan on my patient. That's what a PET scan is. A PET scan is they inject radioactive sugar inside of you and then take an x-ray of you. And wherever that sugar goes, if your elbow lights up like a light bulb, they say, well, there's no reason for your elbow to be eating a bunch of sugar. There must be cancer there. So it's like they already use that for imaging and diagnostic purposes. We're just using that same concept for treatment purposes.
I love it. So in theory, if someone didn't have access to one of these 30 clinics, could they drink orange juice during their chemotherapy treatment and potentially have some benefit?
Kind of the other way around. There's a significant amount of research about going into chemotherapy fasting. So 13 hours is the magic number, where if you hit 13 hours at the time the infusion is going in, basically you make the cancer so starving because your blood sugar is so low, right? The cancer is like, gimme, opens up all the doors. Cancer has 25 times more insulin receptors than normal cells do. So really, it opens all the floodgates, and just whatever you put into the veins after that are going to preferentially go there more so compared to the normal cells in the fasted state. And then you take some food or some sugar and then you shut all the gates to keep it closed. So you go into it fasting to get it in there and then you shut the gate.
So you eat after you start the chemotherapy or after the chemotherapy's done?
They usually won't let you eat it during because they don't want you to choke, I guess, and go into anaphylaxis or something like that. But yeah, as soon as you're done with the IV, start eating.
Super interesting. Okay. So you mentioned earlier that cancer metabolizes a lot like a bacteria and a fungus metabolize. And when I think about cancer, I think about autophagy, and I think about when that does not work well or clean up a programmed cell death, right? Then we have this diseased cells, and then we have diseased tissue, and then what is going to turn that tissue into malignancy? And then there's some people that say, yeah, it's fungus that's running amok, or sometimes parasites, or some kind of immune stimulation or immune insult, perhaps, that's turning on that tissue into malignancy. This is just like, I have been thinking about this a lot, which is why I reached out to you, because I'm just like on a real cancer kick right now with having friends being diagnosed. And you're probably not surprised. Like, I think you shared this the other day. An alarming number of this age group are being diagnosed with cancer. And so I'm just feeling really called to this topic. What do you think about the development or malignancy being turned on from cancer? This is like how my brain's thinking about it, but what do you think about it? You know 1,000 times more than I do.
So whatever is happening right now is scary and we don't know. Like if we would have had this interview a year or two ago and you would have said, what is your patient population? I would have said mostly 60 and 70-year-olds, people that get cancer. Right now, more than half my practice is in their 20s and 30s coming in with stage 4 diagnoses. And it was a rapid shift. You don't see a demographic shift 30, 40 years in a year. So something's going on. We try to search around and find out about what's really happened. And you can only make conjecture right now, but we're trying to figure that out. But to your point is yes. And the research does know that there's I don't know if you're familiar and listeners are familiar with something called the Warburg effect. Oder Warburg was this guy back in the 20s that basically studied cancer, and he won the Nobel Prize for saying that cancer lives in an acidic environment. So that's for the last 100 years, all these people have been trying to juice away their cancer, or hydrogen peroxide away their cancer to try to get rid of the acidity of cancer. The problem is that doesn't work in real life so much. You can't really just pump a bunch of hydrogen peroxide in your body and change your pH to kill the cancer, because that was a petri dish. And again, we're talking about humans. Human pH is incredibly narrow window. It doesn't allow fluctuations. The cancer makes a little acidic bubble around itself that's kind of separate from normal human tissue. So the last 100 years, everyone in the medical world has worked under this idea of the Warburg effect, where cancer is creating acid around it. And we have found out that's not actually the case anymore. It's something that's called the reverse Warburg effect, which you guys can Google image and find some little diagrams on it. Basically, the reverse Warburg effect is cancer cells and precancer cells squirt out these products, we'll call them, squirt out these cellular signals that tell all the healthy cells around them. It hijacks the healthy cells around them to start pumping out the acid and to start pumping out basically protective mechanisms so that the cancer can be in an environment that it likes to. The cancer is not turning healthy cells into other cancer cells. It's tricking the healthy cells to go and produce a cancer thriving environment. And that's the tricky part. You can try to go and do chemo and stuff all day long to kill off cancer cells. But if there's all these healthy cells that just keep pumping out the acid and keep saying, yeah, go, new cells come on back, that's where you don't get good outcomes. So that's why integrative oncology is so important, because chemo wipes out the immune system. It stops that ability from being able to fight back. Even if it kills the cancer, the body can't fight back. So you need somebody on your team to help you fight back, help you build up your immune system so that terrain issue doesn't allow the cancer to regrow.
You mentioned earlier a couple of times things that you use to stimulate the immune system to fight cancer. I have a friend who works in cancer nutrition, and we were talking one day about some of the modalities she uses, which are the same for many other things. It's looking at what's going on with the immune system and the microbiome, looking at chronic stress that occurred before, looking at drainage and detoxification. And I was thinking that there's a lot of overlap between really that and autoimmunity. It feels like a lot of that in autoimmunity. However, in autoimmunity, the conversation is, let's not stimulate the immune system because the immune system is already really overstimulated. And I feel like you could almost make that argument in cancer. I mean, I think this is like a conversation. I don't know what you think, but I think I went to something with Jeffrey Bland and they're talking about like stimulating the immune system versus supporting homeostasis. And so it makes sense in your context, right? If you have chemo and you're killing things and you're suppressing the immune system, we want to stimulate it. But what are your thoughts about stimulating immune system cancer-wise? When is it appropriate to stimulate versus not stimulate, I guess is the question.
It's the problem with the question is the oversimplification. And we talk to patients about it that way, about, oh, you're immune suppressed or we need to boost your immune system. The reality is that word immune system is your immune system is many different things. So just like in autoimmunity, so my practice is actually half cancer. The other doctors in my office do autoimmunity. I only see cancer patients. But yeah, it is inherently the same issue where it's immune system modulation that is needed. It's the wrong part of the immune system is activating. We need to lower that down and then stimulate the right part of the immune system. That's where the imbalance is coming. And I tell patients, even just look at your standard CBC blood work. Yes, it says white blood cells at the top. That's not really what we're talking about. You scroll down and it says neutrophils, lymphocytes, eosinophils, basophils, monocytes. That's the subcategory of the white blood cells. That's what we're talking about, is when you have too many of the one and not enough of the other, that's when that imbalance happens.
Oh, we've covered a lot of things today. You brought up a test for monitoring residual disease. And right before that, we were talking about estrogen metabolism. And since you mentioned the one test, I think I should go back. I often say to people that have family history of breast, cervical, ovarian cancer, female cancers, that they should have a test that looks at estrogen metabolism. And the only one I'm familiar with is the Dutch test. Is there anything you want to add to that? Or do you disagree or agree?
I'm not the biggest fan of Dutch tests just because of the issue of, so Dutch, the DU stands for dried urine. There's an issue when you're taking 1 or 2 drops of dried urine, because think about your pee. Sometimes it's white, sometimes it's yellow. It varies so much. So I like the idea of the Dutch test, but doing it through other companies like Genova, that have you collect 24 hours of urine so that you're getting all of the urine, all of the estrogen squirted out for an entire 24-hour period, and then using that as your sample. That doesn't leave issues, because if you drink a bunch of coffee, a Dutch test can be skewed because it changes just how much you're peeing out in your hydration level.
Yeah.
But that exact idea of, yes, look at all the estrogen that people are making and balance it out.
Yeah. You're not supposed to do that when you take a Dutch.
I know.
That doesn't mean,
Yeah.
but it could happen, right? People don't always, that happens all the time. Or in different types of tests, things like that happen all the time for sure.
I don't think that this is garbage. It's just, I prefer the 24-hour urine because I think there's less margin of error.
Yeah, cool. Well, when I talked to Dutch about this, they said, with the one person I talked to who worked with Dutch test said, I think we're the only lab that does estrogen metabolism. So you're bringing up another option from Genova.
Yeah.
So, cool. All right. So we talked about the practice. We talked about mistletoe therapy. We talked about peptide therapy. We talked about IV vitamin C, HBot. We got into little blood tests for screening for colon, breast cancer, ovarian cancer, etc. We talked about things that kind of stink in the cancer realm, which is trying to do things. You see that a lot, right? Where you get to that desperation point where it's like, man, I think that's why I'm so interested in this topic, is like, I feel like we should all be working on cancer prevention all the time, right? We talked a little bit about some meds. We talked a teeny bit about some nutraceuticals. Is there anything you want to say about any other nutraceuticals in cancer? Whether here are some things that are 100% contraindicated and I take people off of them all the time, or these things are really supportive during chemotherapy for liver protection. Anything you want to say to that point?
So the tricky part, and that's why I say find an expert over and over, is because every chemo, there's dozens of different chemos and every one has different things it interacts with. So it's a really hard question to answer. I'll say if there's anything that is generally a good idea, it's medicinal mushrooms. The medicinal mushrooms basically don't interact with anything. So reishi, maitake, shiitake, turkey tail, there's various different medicinal mushrooms out there. Those are always a good idea in cancer. In terms of the avoidance, it's really two things that I very commonly, every patient comes in taking and I have to throw it away and they get mad at me for doing it, is going to be their methylated vitamins, their methylated B vitamins. It's a hot topic in functional medicine right now where patient talks to their oncologist and says, I want to do some natural stuff alongside my chemo. Oncologist says, I don't know any of this stuff. So then they go and find a functional medicine doctor that randomly puts them on a bunch of methylated vitamins. Methyl donors are on signals. A lot of Americans that are fatigued, overweight, depressed, you give them a bunch of on signals and suddenly they feel good. Well, what is cancer? Cancer is cells that's all they know how to do is turn on. They don't know how to turn off. And that's, you look at a B12, a methyl B12 supplement, it's 1,000 times the daily value of methyl B12. That's 100,000 times the daily value sometimes, right? That's 100,000 times every day saying, go, 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 grow, grow, grow. That's the exact opposite of what we want to do in cancer. But patients always come in on tons of methylated B complexes, and that's the last thing we want. And then glutathione. Glutathione is probably one of our strongest antioxidants that a lot of people end up on. And glutathione people don't realize that a lot of things you could do to strengthen your body can also strengthen the cancer. That's the tricky part about cancer is it's your own cells. So if you take all the glutathione to try to strengthen your body, well, then you just made the cancer more resistant to the things you're trying to do to kill it off also.
I'm really glad I asked that question. Those were some really good answers. I am not like a giant put people on a bunch of methylated stuff. So I'm glad. Thank you. But I feel like glutathione could be easily missed because it's a huge antioxidant. I do have to ask then, and you might not be able to answer this, if someone is on chemotherapy and they need to strengthen their immune system and they can't get peptides and they maybe, I don't know if they could even go to a med spa and the 5 or 10 grams of IV vitamin C is better than 0 grams. I don't know. Is there anything, you mentioned the medicinal mushrooms, which I think is great. And I see that overlap of that in a lot of places. Is there anything you can safely tell someone this might be supportive in this situation for you? Or not really? Just depends.
Let me also quickly just say, so I don't forget, in order to do 50 grams of vitamin C, there's a blood test you have to do first to make sure you qualify. Because if you have a genetic disorder that you wouldn't even know about and nobody tests you for it, and then they give you IV vitamin C, you could acutely die. So you need to have that test done first. And a lot of times the med spas don't know that. So don't just convince your med spa to randomly give you 50 because you might die. Anyway.
Good one. Thank you.
Let's not kill patients. Yeah, there's a lot of basic things that have a small amount of interaction. So zinc for the immune system. A lot of the things that you would do to fight viruses, it's the same. Your lymphocytes are your white blood cells that fight viruses, but those are also the white blood cells that fight cancer. So a lot of the virally supported stuff in the body is going to be indicated as well. Zinc is a very classic example. Even fish oil. Fish oils, that's what they do, is they modulate those cells' ability to squirt out inflammatory compounds. So if we can get fish oils in there so that the cells can't squirt out so many inflammatory compounds, we're going to significantly get a good resistance to allowing the cancer to be able to thrive.
Mm-hmm. Super helpful. Okay. So we talked about all the stuff we talked about before. We talked about estrogen metabolism. We talked about whether you really ever get away from cancer. We talked about things that you throw away when people bring it in, which was more interesting than I was even expecting. So thank you. And then you talked about some things that are helpful for most people, or at least like a big picture of what that is. We also talked a little bit about cancer versus autoimmune stuff. Is there anything else you really want to throw in here after our conversation today?
There is so much that can be done. Chemo doesn't have to be miserable. Surgery doesn't have to be miserable. And the medical oncologist commonly will tell patients like, well, none of that stuff is studied. We don't know about it. We don't know how it's going to interact. And that's just not the reality of it. Is if you go to the textbook of naturopathic oncology, for example, you go to the end of the textbook and look at the resources section, there's thousands of studies on using these things in cancer patients. And you look at the journals that they're published in, and it's Lancet and the American Oncology Association. It's not crazy alternative medicine journals. It's these normal oncology journals out there. Problem is, if you publish this study on turmeric and cancer and the oncologist reads it, they're like, oh, great, turmeric's good for cancer, but I don't know how to dose it. I don't know what it interacts with, and they don't know how to apply it. So there's so much research on what can be done, specifically studied alongside the chemotherapy, where this makes the chemo more effective or this reduces the side effect of the chemo. You just have to find someone that knows what they are and knows how to dose them appropriately and knows when to use the medications. So you don't have to suffer. The help is there. You just got to find the person that knows how to give the help.
I'm so glad I asked you to come on today. Now, if this happens to me, I know who I'm going to go to. Dr. Robinson, where can people find you?
I'm at nourishhealthcare.org is our website, but also on Facebook and Instagram, it's just Nourish Healthcare. Like I said, we're in the Chicagoland area. We have 3 offices in the suburbs of Chicago, but we work virtually with patients all over the place. So I'm easily findable.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today.
Of course, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Sharing and reviewing this podcast is the best way to help us succeed with our mission to help integrate the best of East and West and empower you to raise the bar on your health story. Just go to reviewthispodcast.com/less stressed life. That's reviewthispodcast.com/less stressed life. And you'll be taken directly to a page where you can insert your review and hit post.